Thanks, Bev. So for everyone who wasn't here yesterday, I wanted to give you just a really abbreviated recap and how we've structured this and why. You'll recall that in the first panel that I moderated along with Henry and a few others, we were trying to get at whether we have the capacity to tackle big problems and what that's going to take. And that began to get into a discussion of how we make decisions collectively. In the panels following, we talked about the two great river sheds in this country and how we think at that scale. And then we narrowed the focus down to how particular cities are addressing water and other issues. You saw in the afternoon, but for those who weren't here in the afternoon, we addressed the issue of data, visualization of large and complex systems, and how to characterize those in a way that people will see them, maybe see them for the first time in a meaningful way, and then do something about them, maybe understanding something that clearly we think is important as we're moving forward in this country, on the planet, frankly. So we talked about data, and then our folks here at the Water Institute of the Gulf, both on stage and over at the Enormous Model, talked about how they're trying to write a framework for understanding this particular ecosystem, what we've done to the built environment, which is evident right outside the window, obviously, and how to get people to pay attention to that in a presumably new and proactive way. So that was the way we ran through yesterday. Today, we're coming back to the notion of cities, because we think cities are drivers of innovation. As I said yesterday, I think they really have become the laboratories of democracy. You're going to hear about several American cities that have great resilience planning going on, some international cities that are doing similar things, some of which have been written about. And then lastly, to bring it all home, because this was a theme that ran throughout the conversation yesterday, how do we communicate these complex issues? You saw the visualizations from our friends who are scientists and engineers. You'll hear from journalists and writers at the last panel who've talked about these major issues. And my question to them is, how effective is what you're writing in the way that you want it to be? You know, what are you saying? Why are you saying it? How is it received? And what's the impact of that? So I think communication is something we'll surely pick up in future 10X conferences. So that's how we've laid out yesterday's schedule leading into today's. Glad to see you all here. We were thinking, since we started yesterday at 8:30, some people may think we're starting at 8:30 again today, so I'm sure we'll fill up the seats. But we're glad to have all of you here. And again, it's been, from my point of view, a spectacular event. And I want to thank again Beverly, John Davies, who I see roaming around here somewhere, Denise, others who've helped to stage this. I just can't thank you enough. So with that, we'll get on to our first panel.
Where's your scooter? You're supposed to be using the scooter. All right. Thanks for coming. Early morning is not my favorite time, but we're going to give this the best shot. So I travel a whole bunch. First of all, my name's Baumgardner, and I work out of Houston, Texas. The firm that I manage is called SWA, and we do a lot of design, urban design, planning work. A lot of the stuff we do is kind of on the ground. You know, we have to get out and understand what people want. And I think what you're going to hear today is we have some chief resiliency officers. We're going to learn what that is, as well as a Riverkeeper, which we're going to learn more about what that is. That should be fun. But you know, I travel a lot with work, and I'm always kind of curious on current events that are going on. And I found this in the newspaper yesterday, which I think is super relevant, but I'm not sure how. House passes measure to allow riverboats on land. Right? Of course, they're talking about casinos, but anyway, think about it. If you can help me draw a connection, that'd be awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna try to kind of push this conversation along, but I don't think I'll have to do too much. Well, I think one of the things that was interesting yesterday, like particularly in hearing about the Colorado River and the Mississippi River, and a lot of these different things, is how those rivers are not really discussed anymore as rivers. It's just infrastructure, right? It's just there to serve our water needs. And those needs are usually drinking and agriculture and industry, right? And I find that fascinating. And I think that if you kind of look at the transect here that we have, in LA, you know, you guys are fed by an aqueduct, which is completely a fake river. You just invented a river, right? And then in El Paso, you guys have a real river, which is the Rio Grande, but you pretty much don't think of it as a river. It's a border, right? And then in Jacksonville, you guys have a beautiful river that you're trying to maintain as a river. Yes. Right? I think in a lot of ways. And it does a lot of different things. I don't want to dumb it down too much. But, I mean, just how you talk about those things seems interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about Houston. And Bill did some of that yesterday, so I'll kind of fill in some. But this is, I guess what I'm interested in is water and how it can brand a city. And I think all of these cities are branded around water and what water means. So in Houston, we have this Bayou network, and it's called, well, it's basically flood control infrastructure. It's run by Harris County Flood Control. And it's about moving water out of our city so it doesn't flood. And yeah, we did flood, but in a lot of ways it worked fairly well, and it has worked fairly well, but we're getting inundated with bigger and bigger storms that happen more and more often. But basically what we did here is we said, look, it's not just stormwater infrastructure. We need to think of it as recreation. And so we made 150 miles, we're in the process of building 150 miles of trails along this infrastructure. Hopefully people will start to appreciate it as bayous again and not just as sort of concrete ditches. And there's lots of metrics and lots of benefits that we've gone through about how we want to connect people through this system. And it starts to change the way people think about Houston. Suddenly it's not just the energy place, it's not just oil, it's not just space. It's suddenly a place that has a lot of nature and a place that has all these bayous that we never knew about. So that brand is important. Another project that we've done is Buffalo Bayou Park. And so that, again, it looks like a park and it looks like a bayou, but it's not. That's a flood control project. And everything we did there has to really be completely designed so it does not increase flooding. It needs to reduce flooding. And so, of course, when we started this project, it was a back door. No one wanted anything to do with it. But now it's the front door, and it is the brand of the city. If you get a postcard or something from Houston, it's going to have a picture of Buffalo Bayou Park on it. It looks like this, right? So there's tall buildings right underneath, or right beside this, and these people are riding bikes and taking canoes in places they never thought they would do it. So that's kind of fun. And, you know, of all places in the world, Houston, you know, happy and healthy, that's kind of crazy. When that came out, we were all like, really? We live here, you know? But that's that branding thing, right? Water has changed the brand of the city. But it's got a new brand, right? So that's Hurricane Harvey. This is not very long ago. And this stuff is happening all the time. If you look at the big picture, yeah, this was our 500-year or whatever number year storm you want to call it, or percent storm. But if you look at the Gulf Coast, there's a 100-year storm, you know, almost, well, at least once a week. I mean, sorry, at least once a year. But they're happening constantly, but just in different watersheds. So as you back out, the problem gets bigger. We need to think about it. The other thing that's happening is that all these people that lost their homes are actually, they're rebuilding in exactly the same places. And that asks huge questions about, you know, resiliency, what are we doing, how do we, you know, fix some of these problems? Or do we just say it's just an inconvenience and we're not going to bother fixing it? This is kind of the big question. This is the park after all this stuff happened. And so all that stuff you see is silt. These are silt benches that were designed to absorb like roughly 18 inches of silt. That was the idea. So again, it worked perfectly. We just didn't expect 6, 8, 10 feet of silt. And that's because of the size of the storm. So much stuff. They've spent, you know, the last months trying to clean the park to make it into a park again. We have just passed legislation, which Bill talked a bit about yesterday. It's exactly what's going to happen. We'll see. But legislation that says, look, we need to be building to 500-year floods, not, or the what, 0.5% flood, as opposed to 100-year floods. There's been some pushback in City Council, but it looks like something's going to happen. We'll keep you posted. The other thing we're doing at the other end of Buffalo Bayou, and this kind of goes into branding, kind of what are these places, but this is the port of Houston, and we're actually working with them and trying to understand what are they going to be doing in the future. Do they have more land than they need? Can we consolidate uses? The port comes way, way, way inland into Houston, 45 miles or so. Most people don't even know it's there, but the city is growing out to meet it, and now they know, and now there's pressure. So we're working with them to try to figure out how to resolve that pressure. The other amazing thing about the port is that in order to keep it going, you have to constantly dredge the bayou, right? We're trying to get it down to like 45 or 50 feet deep. But all that dredging, it kind of secretes nature, which is kind of weird, right? In order to make the port operate, it makes nature. And it makes nature in these islands, those kind of green blobs out there, that all that dredge material gets put upon, right? So that suddenly becomes wetlands, it becomes bird habitat. We'd like to see, is it human habitat as well that maybe could happen with camping and other kinds of bay activities. Oysters love, for whatever reason, they love the ships that go by and some of the shoaling that happens with that. So anyway, it's creating a very kind of bizarre ecosystem between industry and nature, and they start to depend upon each other. We're looking at found spaces and try to think about how to convert old cotton mills and cotton storage facilities into new uses. And portions of the port may suddenly look like this into the future. Or that's some of that nature that gets created from the port. So, and that's kind of the big picture, kind of standing back and trying to think, how does the port brand the city? Because this is, a major piece of economic infrastructure for us. So I think that's all I'm going to talk about. Do your bit?
Yeah.
You have one of these.
Yeah, I'll use this one,
Right.
but I could.
You need that one.
So, hi everyone. Good morning. My name is Marissa Aho, and I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Los Angeles. And it's a pleasure to be here representing the City of Los Angeles, as well as Mayor Eric Garcetti, my boss. I'm going to stand up, I think, so that I can, against doctor's orders, so that I can talk to you about what I put in these slides, because I don't remember. So I wanted to take you on a little bit of a resilience journey in Los Angeles just to orient you, and then we're going to focus on 2 projects that we're doing in Los Angeles. But resilience to Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti says this all the time, is a value. It's something that we were trying to embed in everything that we do. And he's been in office about 5 years, and we've released 3 strategies that help us on our resilience journey. And this is the first, and it's Resilience by Design. It was released at the end of 2014. And it was a collaboration with former USGS seismologist Dr. Lucy Jones. And it really focused on our seismic risk and resilience around 3 of our most vulnerable areas. Our buildings, which I'll skip today, telecommunications, which I'll also skip today. But then the third was water, and really fortifying our water systems. And that's a whole host of things. Our Department of Water and Power is the largest publicly owned municipality, or utility, sorry. And they have more than 7,000 miles of pipe. And for those of you less familiar with the challenges in California, we're trying to address through Resilience by Design and a number of our other strategies, climate change, seismic risk, supply reduction, rising water costs, local groundwater contamination, and Bay Delta uncertainty, among other challenges, stresses and shocks. And this gives you a little bit of a sense of our seismic risk, which you wouldn't necessarily talk about at a water conference, and yet it's so very important. So the City of Los Angeles imports 85% of our water across the San Andreas Fault. And so when we're looking at a major seismic event in Los Angeles, the San Andreas could offset our water system by 40 feet, which cuts off our aqueduct. And there are 3 other aqueducts that come to Southern California, so you would think that that would be redundant and okay, except the San Andreas Fault cuts off all of those aqueducts. And so we have a bit of a challenge in reinforcing our own aqueduct and then working with partners who own the other 3 aqueducts to look at the system as a whole instead of as individual aqueducts, as we try and increase our resilience to our seismic challenge there. And then locally, we also have experienced a number of pipe breaks during the 1994 Northridge earthquake. And unlike some of the other cities represented today, our last major shock was 24 years ago, and we're still implementing lessons that we learned then. And one of them was that our water system breaks when there's an earthquake, and that's just the way that it is. So a few years ago, and as part of Resilience by Design, our Department of Water and Power started one small little pilot. I think it was January of 2015, and they imported Kubota pipes, which are seismic resilient pipes from Japan. And we kicked it off near the Northridge Hospital and installed these pipes for the first time. And then that followed by 4 other pilots throughout sort of the next year. And this is the pipe. And it bends in an earthquake, right? It survives. And it also doesn't leak during a regular day, which is incredibly helpful to our water goals. And so I am very pleased to report that this pilot has turned into a greater thinking about our water infrastructure and the idea of creating a seismic resilient pipe network throughout the city so that we can have at least some pipes be reliable after a seismic event. And we can use them regularly. We can use them after a seismic event, but we can also use them to address our fire following earthquake risk, which is another major challenge that we have. I'm going to keep going, a few minutes here. So the next journey, or plan in our journey, is the Sustainable City Plan, and this was released in 2015, and we're in the process of updating it now. And the first chapter in the Sustainable City Plan is about water, and really is where we've committed to having 50% local water by 2035, which helps with our conservation goals, also helps with our seismic risk, because if we can rely on local water, then we don't have to be so concerned about the fact that 85% of our water crosses a major fault. And there are a number of other great targets around water in here as well. But I'm going to save some time for this plan, which is the last stop in our journey. So Mayor Garcetti released our Resilient Los Angeles strategy a little over 2 months ago on March 2nd. And this really focuses on 5 major resilience themes. Clearly, we heard a lot yesterday about how important leadership is. So leadership and engagement, disaster preparedness and recovery, economic security, climate adaptation, and infrastructure modernization. And it's designed in a way where there are 4 chapters. And the first chapter is really about what Angelenos can do to increase resilience in their own backyards, with their families, in small businesses. The second is about what neighborhoods can do. We're more than 500 square miles. Different neighborhoods have different challenges. In Venice, it's sea level rise. In Chatsworth, it's wildfires. And how do we look at each neighborhood and address their resilience challenges? And then the third chapter is what the city can do, and clearly that's solving for more than one thing at a time, using data-driven decision makings and so on. And then the fourth chapter is really looking beyond the city boundaries to our partners, both geographically and in other sectors. And water runs throughout this entire strategy as well. And it's really fundamental to everything that we are doing. And so I'm going to end on one part. We have 96 actions in the strategy, 15 goals, but goal 13 is to foster a healthy and connected Los Angeles River system. And we're very proud of our infographics. We tried to make a 180-page document readable. And this describes our ultimate goal. Los Angeles has been talking about revitalizing our river for decades now. But it's really getting some traction, and the city's been investing a lot in connecting people. We just kicked off a new pedestrian bridge, I think last week, and really looking at our relationship to the river. And lots of Angelinos and others don't really know that we have a river, right? This is it. And it's a 51-mile corridor, and the first 32 miles are in the city of Los Angeles. And it's, well, it was one of our biggest shocks in our city. In the 30s, it flooded and killed a number of people. And we are focused a lot on our drought challenge, and we don't always focus on the fact that we have this flooding risk because this river runs through a number of communities. More than 400,000 people live within 1 mile of this river. It's incredibly urbanized, but it's also a partnership opportunity because 8 of the 15 city council offices are near the river. 4 out of our 5 supervisorial districts run throughout the river. There are 16 other cities that are adjacent to the river and 3 major government partners, including the federal government. And this all kind of started when there was flooding in the 30s, and the Army Corps, as you all know around here, solved that problem very well, but created some other challenges in the meantime. And so just the photo above is what we have today. If anyone saw the movie Grease, our river's pretty famous there. But the photo below is the goal. And the opportunity that we had was really to look at how to advance all of our river revitalization efforts through the resilient strategy by working with our river team and really coupling those efforts, because we recognize that a resilient river is a revitalized river, and that it's the backbone of the city and will really help us in our resilience journey. There we go.
Jump right in, okay.
Tell us about El Paso.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Ferrini. I am the Chief Resilience Officer and also the Director of Community and Human Development for the city of El Paso. And I'm very excited to be here amongst my fellow city leaders. I think, particularly looking at the number of cities that are included in this corridor that we've identified, I think El Paso tends to get forgotten, and I'm glad it did not get forgotten here. El Paso is 1/2 of the largest binational metroplex in the Western Hemisphere. The city of El Paso itself is about 685,000 people. However, if you consider the entire metroplex, which when you start to talk about places like Dallas-Fort Worth or even the Phoenix metroplex, you start to really try to include all of the communities in and around a major city hub. El Paso is the major city hub of the binational metroplex of about 2.5 million people. This image behind me is one of my favorites, because what you are looking at in the bottom half of that image is the city of El Paso, and what you are looking at the foot of that mountain in the top half of the image is Ciudad Juarez. And so you can see here that when I talk about the binational metroplex, I'm not talking about 2 cities separated by 200 or 300 miles. I am talking about one city that is separated by an artificial border. How do I use this? Do I just click on the green bit? All right. So in 2013, the city of El Paso was selected as one of the 100 in the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative. In 2014, the city hired its first Chief Resilience Officer. Hi. One of the things that was really exciting for me is that I'm a native El Pasoan, and it was very important to me that this work move from the grassroots up, and that this really be about highlighting the potential that El Paso has, but also pushing us off that precipice of potential. I think that El Paso for many, many years has been on the verge of something gigantic. We're tired of being on the verge. we're ready to take that leap. And so part of the resilience strategy was looking at not just the city of El Paso, but the entire binational metroplex. And so number one, we want to be a vibrant desert city. I think that we share a lot of commonalities in terms of water challenges. We have either way too much or way too little. We get about 8 inches a year, and actually I was talking with my colleagues from Phoenix yesterday, and we were saying, yeah, we say 8 inches, but we're not actually sure that that really happens. We probably get 4 or 5 of those in a span of about 2 or 3 days, and then it doesn't rain again all year. And so there's a lot of challenges in the way that we manage that, and how do we build out this binational metroplex in an arid environment with those challenges, environmentally speaking. The second pillar of our resilience strategy was to build a binational economy, but not just any binational economy. What we really wanted to do is take a look at what are the challenges that we face in this community, whether they be social or environmental, and how do we start to look at our economic development incentives and our business retention and expansion efforts and leverage that against the challenges that we have. How do we filter our incentives through a set of values that says, if you're going to come and you're going to invest in El Paso, if you're going to invest in the binational metroplex, you really need to have an understanding of what our community is and what our community needs are. How do we take innovation in the private sector and leverage that against some of the environmental challenges that we have? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. The third pillar was about empowering El Pasoans. It's not enough to engage folks. You have to empower them. You have to give them the tools to shape the future of their city. As a representative of the municipality, it's not for us to tell the people how the city should grow. It's for them to dialogue with us about how we shape it together. And so that's really what Empowered El Pasoans is about. Yesterday we talked a lot about leadership. We talked a lot about how we communicate with folks. I think that leadership can come from the community back towards the governmental entity. But again, you have to make sure that that is an informed dialogue and that it's not just sort of a perceptual conversation, right? You have to make sure that you're moving forward based on fact. And then finally, our last pillar, but I think one of the most important, is that the idea of resilient governance. A resilient government is collaborative, it's globally connected, but it's also extremely reflective of the community that it serves. And that again goes back to the idea of empowered El Pasoans. So just to give you guys a little bit of geography here, what you're looking at is an aerial photo of the binational metroplex. Is there a pointer here? Can I point? No, I can't. Yes. All right, chew. All right, I'm just a simple architect. I don't know how to use these things. So what you're looking at here is the bottom of the Rocky Mountain chain. This is the Franklin Mountains. The Franklin Mountains contains the largest urban state park in an urban environment in the country. It is a tremendous ecotourism feature for us, but it is also a tremendous challenge in terms of how you have this mountain and the way water moves around it, and how that interacts with the city that's growing all up and down this mountain here. It really bisects this whole part of the city. This is the western portion. You can see how this is predominantly developed, but then you start to move into some pretty significant agricultural areas here on the northwest side of our community. Does anybody want to take a stab at where the border is? Everybody's kind of pointing, and I'm like, So this is the border right here. This is the river that you mentioned, the river. And I say that a little bit facetiously because we don't really use it that way. However, what you can also see here is that it's really just this sliver that separates what is one city. This is all Ciudad Juarez right in here. Okay. Also, what you have up here, this is Fort Bliss. This is the second largest military base by land area in the country. It is the largest by population. So one of the things that's very important to recognize in terms of natural resources is how we support such a significant component of our community that, quite frankly, is very separate from the purview of the municipal government. How are we working together with the base? How, when they do realignment and they bring in 20,000 families, do we then support that in terms of infrastructure? And so that's just a very important piece to recognize. Here's just another really, I think, beautiful shot from the top of the mountain. This is looking towards the northeast section of El Paso. This is an image from the top of the Franklin Mountains looking straight south. This is the border, right here. Okay, so again, you're just seeing one giant city, shared air, shared water, shared culture. Here's an image looking to the northwest. But I think what you're looking at here is really interesting because what you're seeing is how water naturally moves from the top of the mountain down the arroyos into the valley. And there's a lot of challenges in terms of how do we deal with that. We're seeing a lot of physical development in these areas. They're very attractive to folks. They're attractive to developers because you've got the ecotourism component. You've got, nature in your backyard. But at the same time, there's a lot of risk in terms of building in those areas. Here's just another image of South El Paso. Again, looking at the sort of foot of the Franklin Mountains here. And this, I can't really see it that well. I don't know if you guys can see it better than I can, but this is just a little bit of a view of the neighborhood scale. I think folks think of El Paso as this very sort of flat, dry, rock-covered community, and we're really not. This is one of the oldest neighborhoods in our urban core. And this is our downtown. This is the way that we're looking at developing. This is right off of our central plaza. We call it San Jacinto Plaza. And these are the kind of events that we're doing to sort of bring folks out and educate them about the different kinds of intervention that we can do as a city, but also that they can participate in. So what we did here was we not only temporarily chalked out a bike lane, we brought in the trees, we brought in the buffer. We tried to illustrate to folks how things might look if we started to build a little bit differently. And here's just an image of our downtown. And with that, I will pass it over.
Let's hear about Jacksonville.
There you go. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Rinaman, and I'm here on behalf of the City of Jacksonville, not city government. We're actually a privately funded, not-for-profit organization. And we're a watchdog group for the St. Johns River. We actually are focused on protecting, restoring, and defending the St. Johns River through citizen-based advocacy. We're part of an international organization. Our parent organization is the Waterkeeper Alliance. We have 340 waterkeepers around the world in 44 countries. We have 174 waterkeepers in the United States, and we have many in the Southeast. In fact, I'm so happy that Cassie Calloway is here, a Mobile Baykeeper, one of our rock stars in our organization. And in the state of Florida now, we have 13 waterkeepers, so we're working together to really focus on having a more resilient Florida. A resilient river means a resilient community. A healthy river means a healthy economy. And one of the reasons we're focused on this is really bringing this from the grassroots level up, because in the state of Florida, we have challenges with the lack of leadership on this issue. Our governor does not use the word sea level rise unless it's self-serving. In fact, there's been people fired in his organization in the last 8 years. He's rolled back water quality protections for 4 decades. And our city mayor, actually in 2013, we were awarded a Rockefeller grant as one of the 100 Most Resilient Cities program. But unfortunately, the new mayor that was elected 2 years later sent the grant back. And that was right before we were hit with back-to-back hurricanes with Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Irma. So we are working to fill that void. We are at the most eastern end of I-10 and very happy to be here because it is so refreshing to have this conversation with elected leaders as well as professionals and all of you that are dedicating to this conversation across our country. So we're at the very top of this. This map is of our watershed. Jacksonville is in the lower basin of the St. Johns River because our river flows north. It flows north for over 310 miles, but it only drops in elevation 27 feet. And that elevation drop is in the very the upper end, which is in the southern portion of our state, kind of southeast of Orlando. And it drains 8,800 square miles. So it's a huge ecosystem, a huge watershed, and all the water that drains out of this 88 square mile area makes its way through downtown Jacksonville, which is here behind us. The river literally runs through our community, so that gives us a very a great audience because you can't go anywhere in Jacksonville without going out over one of our 7 bridges. And so the rivers, it really shapes us as a community, but it also, there's a lot of people that value the river. The challenge is deciding on how we protect our river together because we have different ideas, but we're working that through a citizen-driven conversation. Whoops, that's the Hurricane Irma was a wake-up call for us in Jacksonville. While we knew to expect flooding, we saw the storm coming. By the time the storm hit Jacksonville on the East Coast, we actually had, it was a downgraded Category 1. It was most likely a tropical storm, but we were hit with Category 3 storm surge. In fact, the flooding didn't match any of the models, anything that was predicted, and a lot of people were caught off guard. In fact, we had to evacuate out of their homes by boat more than 300 people because no one saw it coming. And part of it, it was the perfect storm. There was a nor'easter that was pushing water in. It was coming up the state, and so it was pushing a lot of water up through that 8,800 square miles. 22 trillion gallons of water fell in our watershed. At one point, there were 88 million gallons a day coming through the Jacksonville area. On an average day, we see about 5 billion with a B gallons a day of fresh water coming in and are trying to get out of the river. And there's about 15 billion gallons of salt water coming in from the Atlantic Ocean. So it's very dynamic and very, we call it the mighty river because it's very challenging to deal with the tides and the currents. Due to the flatness of our rivers tidally influence 150 miles upstream. And so if you start looking at sea level rise projections, just a foot of sea level rise is going to have flooding impacts 150 miles upstream. Luckily, some of the smaller communities that are in the central part of the state are starting to have a sea level rise conversation, even though we're not seeing that with our elected leadership in the Jacksonville area, which represents about 1 million people. The Tampa Bay Times actually did an investigative report right after Hurricane Irma, acknowledging the fact that one of the reasons we flooded so badly is we're our own worst enemy. We have antiquated infrastructure. Most of our storm drainage system that was put in Jacksonville was put in back in the 70s or before. So before some of the regulations were in place and some of the design standards. So all of our drainage system was designed for during a time that we weren't thinking about rising water. In downtown Jacksonville since the 70s, we've seen a 5-inch increase in water levels. And in fact, we actually see a higher increase inland than we're seeing on the coast, which indicates that some of the rise we're seeing is not only sea level rise, but also man-made things that we've undermined our own system. Part of the reason is that we have dredged and straightened and deepened and widened our river for more than 100 years. Back before we started manipulating the St. Johns, there were sandbars at the mouth. There were nice oxbows and curves. There was an average depth of about 12 feet. But in the quest to get more ships coming into our port, we've straightened, we've deepened, we've taken out those natural protections, those sandbars. And while creating a superhighway for boats and cargo ships to come into our port, we've also created a superhighway for the Atlantic Ocean. And so we're seeing a lot more salt water coming in. We see saltwater intrusion for 100 miles inland. And the saltwater intrusion is making us more vulnerable because it's damaging our freshwater grasses. We're actually losing our wetlands and our grasses at an alarming rate, not only due to saltwater intrusion, but also development. And that's taking away that flood protection. It's also taking away the kidneys of the river. We're losing the river's ability to filter out the pollution, and it's important critical habitat for our fisheries. Just recently, the port has started dredging an additional 7 miles. We're now at 40 feet. They want to go to 47 feet for 13 miles inland. Their own reports predict that that's going to increase water levels by 2.5 inches overnight. and in such a flood-prone area that will definitely increase our flood risk. But the Army Corps has not done a flood analysis. They've only looked at the level changes in the channel itself. So overnight, they're going to accelerate sea level rise by 25 years, taking 25 years off our planning horizon in a community where we're not doing the planning, so we don't have a resiliency officer. The good news is we are starting to make sure that we are doing our part as citizens. Citizens are coming together, and we have a great federal partner with NOAA. NOAA has looked at the lower St. John's and indicating we need to focus on resiliency. We have, along with our partners, submitted 2 resiliency projects. This is called the Emerald Necklace. It's 2 urban creeks that are unfortunately silted in. There needs to be restoration of those creeks. They wrap around our downtown, and we've submitted those to be certified as a resiliency project. It has been accepted, and if this is actually designed properly, it could absorb floodwaters as well as create green space in times of normal conditions. We've also submitted the restoration of our largest tributary. It's the Ocklawaha River. It was dammed in 1968 as part of the failed Cross-Florida Barge Canal, and it's severing our greatest tributary from the St. John's. Overnight, if this was restored, it would restore 15,000 acres of forested floodplain that could provide water quality, freshwater filtration, as well as flood protection. Just recently, after 5 years of work, 2 hurricanes, and 11 months of research, our local paper is finally addressing this issue. It's a huge win for us because suddenly everyone is paying attention that the ocean is a threat, the waters are rising, and so we're having a conversation, and we're going to drag our elected officials kicking and screaming until we make sure that we're focusing on a resilient city. I've learned so much from each of you. I'm happy to be here, looking forward to the rest of the day today, but thank y'all for pulling this together, and thank you for all the things y'all brought to the table too. But I'll turn it back to our moderator for a conversation.
Thank you, I got it. Okay, that's great. So you can see 3 really different points of view on 3 really different cities. But I'm also interested in what you guys do, right? So we have 2 resiliency officers, and I would say 5 years ago, probably nobody even heard of what that was, right? And I think there's probably still questions in a lot of people's minds. What is a chief resiliency officer? I'm sure that you guys have to not only grapple with what is it that you do, right? Because it's a new position and communicating that to people, but then you have to actually go out and do something with it, right? And it sounds like that's a huge challenge. But I'd love to hear the 2 of you guys kind of talk a little bit about what is that and what are the challenges with it? Because
Sure.
it's a new thing.
No, it absolutely is. And as I mentioned, I was hired as the resilience officer in late 2014, and I think I spent the subsequent 3 years answering that question. Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm the chief resilience officer. Wow, what is that? Do you do flooding? Are you a flood expert? And you know, because there's this perception that resilience is purely a disaster response. And actually, when I was first hired, they actually structurally put us in the emergency management office. And that's not inappropriate, but it's a small part of what resilience really means. And so I think the biggest thing that's difficult for folks to grapple with is that, yes, we're dealing with issues of flooding. Yes, we're dealing with issues of drought. Maybe it's energy demand. Maybe it's urban sprawl. But actually, in reality, it's all of those things. And how do you address all of those things in the context of, in our case, the binational metroplex, in the context of this sort of bicultural environment? And so really getting out in the community, helping folks to understand, and then to your point, physically manifesting projects that demonstrate resilience is one of the most important things that we can do. I was about to say that I'm really excited to hear that you've got a couple of these projects going on, because I think what's going to happen is that as they start to deliver results, it starts to become impossible not only for the public but for your elected leadership to deny the value, to the point that I think Marissa was making when she started, the value of this kind of integrated thinking. And my background is architecture, so I'm going to talk about it in terms of integrated design. But it's integrated design, it's systems thinking at a policy, economic, and social level.
Wow. Marissa, what about you?
Sure. So tomorrow is I'm celebrating 3 years as Los Angeles' first chief resilience officer, and I must say they have gone by so quickly. and I like to describe being a chief resilience officer, especially I think in Los Angeles, as just matchmaking, just one big matchmaker. Because the city has so many things going on already, and when we started this process, you know, we have all of these strategies. We were really looking at not changing the way we do things, but really building on the existing efforts. And so one of the things that I may have at one point been told to stay in my lane, which I do not do well. And so I said to people, you know, I'm not trying to take on your job. I have my own job. It's really about, you know, being in the same car, being in the same lane. Maybe you're driving. This analogy works really well in Los Angeles. Maybe I'm driving, but we're in the HOV lane, and we're going to go further faster if we coordinate. And so it was really, at the beginning, it was really a task of learning what everyone was doing and the challenges that they were having, whether that be the planning department or our emergency management department or our sustainability team, which is separate, but we work with them regularly. And then figuring out what we could bring to the table and what we could highlight, and the external partners and academic partners and private sector partners that could help the city in achieving our resilience goals. And so now that the strategy's out, I'm pleased to report that people are coming to my door with resources and asking me how they can help implement the strategy. And so it's just going to be more matchmaking from here on out.
Something I just want to add to that, I was having this conversation yesterday, but I say this all the time. Sustainability and resilience are not the same thing. And I think that that was a really big challenge in starting this conversation, is that, you know, folks said, you know, well, resilience is the new sustainability. I said, no, orange is not the new black. That's not what we're trying to do. I mean, these are two inextricably linked concepts, but resilience is really about a community or a system's capacity to bounce back or bounce forward following, you know, a shock or a chronic stress, whereas sustainability is more about that marathon, right? It's more about the long-term thinking. And sustainability even, I think, is misconstrued often as being solely about an environmental story. It's not. It's got to be all of these things. You can't stay in your lane. There are no lanes. I mean, we're talking about, particularly in terms of a municipal government, just what it takes us to keep the lights on a daily basis, right? The complexity of running a city. I can't even imagine a city the size of Los Angeles, but even a city the size of El Paso. We're accountable to 685,000 people. 685,000 lives daily depend on us doing our jobs and not staying in our lane, and making sure that that quality of life continues to improve, and that we're taking all of these things into consideration.
So resiliency is hard, like math, right?
Yeah.
But so what's interesting though, so you guys, as being, you know, you're embedded in government, right? And so, you know, part of your job too is that the mayor needs to get reelected and the city council needs to be happy, right? And so that means public engagement. You have to go out and you know, cajole and kind of get people to do things. But Lisa, your job's a little different because you're an NGO, and I'm sure that you have to go out and engage and try to make people happy, but you also sue them sometimes, which makes them unhappy. And so it's a very different kind of, even though you're working to similar goals, there's a very different approach, I would think.
Well, there is and there's not. It's all about consensus building, not only with our membership. We're membership funded, so we have a lot of bosses out there, just like city governments do. But we try to resolve issues based in good science and negotiate up front. We do flex our legal muscle in that negotiation, hoping that that will lead to a better result. But we prefer a focus on negotiations, like with the dredging. We actually partner with the city and the port and the Chamber of Commerce to do a pre-settlement. We agreed not to challenge the dredging if they would step up and do the mitigation that the Army Corps pulled off the table. And we actually had a legal MOU, a memo of understanding, and went forward, celebrated. Unfortunately, it didn't get to the finish line. But it is building consensus and getting awareness. And if we're not showing up and making sure that we're speaking to a larger community, we're not going to have the political clout to get the movement of the elected officials. So we do forums, we work with communities at a community level on the threats in their area, how it relates to the river, and also take a lot of people out on our boat to get them out on the river talking about how we're all connected. So there's a lot of politics in the environmental public side as well.
Okay.
I even think that from being embedded in the municipal government, we also I think have a huge responsibility to help our electeds tell the right story. We have to make sure that they are given all of the data in a way that's manageable, not just for them but for the public. And I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday in terms of how do you take a concept as complicated as what we're talking about and make that digestible for the community. But I will tell you that more than any presentation or more than any talk that you can do or town hall or any question you can answer, it's those demonstrable results, because they become undeniable, particularly if you frame them in the context of economic development. This is always something that, particularly in Texas, if you're talking about climate change, maybe not, depending on what community you're in. But at the end of the day, it's the economy, stupid. Remember that from the 90s, right? Yeah, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but yeah, it's really true. So if you can make that argument and you can demonstrate those results, you give your elected officials the cover they need to make the tough decisions. And that's really, I think, what part of our job is.
So the other thing which I would guess is an issue is, all these issues that you guys have to deal with day to day. I think that the public probably comes across, or they think most of those things are nuisances. They're not critical, right? 2 inches of flooding that you guys are going to get if they do the dredging, that's just a nuisance. Is that really critical? The same with, having to deal with, Mexico, because you guys are kind of operate as one city, especially how your water works, right? You have aquifers
Absolutely.
underneath both.
Right.
Having to deal with those guys, it's a nuisance. Is it really critical? And I think it's the same with LA. Earthquakes, right? Yeah, I can understand the criticality of it, but on the other hand, you keep building and you keep doing all these things in that hazard zone, and it's just a nuisance. How do you get people to actually get beyond nuisance?
Gonna jump on this. So something that I learned from our friends in hurricane areas is hurricane amnesia. And so I quickly translated that to earthquake amnesia. And like I said, it's been 24 years in Los Angeles since we've had a major disruption, and Northridge was like a mild earthquake. And so how do you engage people who think that things are fine? And most days it's 70-something degrees and sunny and life is great. And the day that we released the resilience strategy, it actually poured down rain the entire day. And it was a reminder that things are not always 72 and sunny. But we did some research. A friend of mine at USC, former professor, helped me to quantify the number of people in Los Angeles who weren't there or alive during the early 90s and don't remember the riot/uprising or the Northridge earthquake or our higher crime rates at the time. And it was approximately 42% of the folks in our city of 4 million weren't around during those days. And so it is a challenge to convince them that they need to take personal action. But it's also an opportunity that I think we have, both in the municipality and with community members, is to not say everything is fine. And I think part of being, a change maker and enabler is to be really honest about things like all of our water could be cut off for 6 to 18 months. Do you have a few gallons in your home just in case? And the importance of the fact that every single person in the city should be building resilience in the city, and if they're not, if one part of this scale is not working, then none of it's really going to work.
Kinder, we have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, should we
if we
do-
want to turn to some audience engagement.
Sure,
I don't know
we
if we
can do
have
that.
questions.
Yeah. Do you guys have questions? Would you like to learn more about resiliency? Yes.
So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what y'all's definition of resiliency is. You said it's not the same as sustainability, and I hear it used a lot now on social media and conferences like this, and I just want to go a little deeper on that.
So I'll give you the short version. Resilience is the capacity to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of whatever's thrown at you. I'm very careful to say in the face of whatever's thrown at you, because you can be resilient to a disaster, you can be resilient to a negative shift in your community, but I think that you can also be, you also have to be resilient in the face of positive change. And so El Paso is a big example of this. We're growing tremendously in terms of our physical footprint. I guess we're about half the physical size of LA. You said 500 square miles. We're about 265 square miles. But we're growing and growing and growing, and that's a great thing. There's a lot of economic growth associated with that. We're seeing a lot more people interested in living in the area. We're seeing that sort of domestic migration, if you will, in addition to the international migration that we appreciate in our community. But it's important that we understand how to brace for that. How do we grow with that? How do we make sure that that growth doesn't outpace us and we end up in a position where we don't have enough resources? And I would just also say that resilience is not just about crisis management, right? Being a resilient community can just improve quality of life, quality of place, make you a better community, a stronger community. And so it's not just about reacting, if you will.
And if I could just add a little to that, in regard to the river, we actually look at it in a way to fortify the river to deal with future impacts, which is an opportunity for us to restore the river and try to undo the sins of the past. And so we see it as revitalization, restoration, but fortifying the river and the tributaries in the community to absorb the future impacts.
Just a little bit more on the resilient officer position. Do y'all have staffs, or y'all one-man gangs, or do y'all, what kind of authorities do you have? And you know, how do you actually go about your daily work? Do you have technical staffs or more?
Sure. So in Los Angeles, we're an office of 2, and we were an office of 1 for 18 months. So it's a lot about relationships and working with others who aren't necessarily in our office. But I will say that when we released the resilience strategy in March, part of it was a mayoral executive directive that asked 28 of our departments to appoint departmental chief resilience officers. And so now I have the great pleasure of working with, it turned out to be more than 28 departmental chief resilience officers. And so we're in the process of building out that network and really, you know, like I said, if resilience is a value of the administration and of our city, it shouldn't be something that 2 people in the mayor's office are in charge of. It should really be something that all 45,000 employees of the city have a role in, and so we're in the process of making sure that that happens.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Gonzalez, Houston Advanced Research Center. And in Houston, one of the conversations that we're starting to have after Harvey is about equity. And there's this growing realization and understanding that not all neighborhoods and communities within the Houston region have equally benefited from like gray infrastructure projects, transportation projects, and now we're talking about things like green infrastructure and, you know, public green space. And not all communities have equal access to the political process and engaging their political leaders. So I was just wondering if you could speak to some of your experiences in your communities in terms of how you're dealing with equity issues.
So I would say that that's actually such a relevant conversation, because if you look at the way the city of El Paso has developed, you look at South El Paso, just immediately north of the border, and you've got 3 of the most impoverished neighborhoods in the city, 2 of which are like second and third most impoverished in the country, okay? And so what we've done is we've really pushed a lot of our infrastructure into those neighborhoods, and we've really burdened those neighborhoods in terms of highway infrastructure, in terms of sort of centralized ponding areas and different things like that. But we've not considered how do we leverage that infrastructure to enhance those neighborhoods, because we've just dumped it on them. But you don't see that same kind of development in some of the more affluent areas of our city. And so in those areas, you're seeing more creative ways to deal with infrastructure. You're seeing the beautification, you're seeing the green infrastructure. And so that conversation really has to start happening. But I think that the city is really starting to push that in terms of looking at how we redevelop the urban core in a way that doesn't shove those folks out, but really respects those neighborhoods, but also addresses the infrastructure needs that we have.
I think we have time for one more right there.
Nicole, you seem to be getting all the good questions, and I'll ask this one of you as well. When I think of I-10, I think of it as an American interstate, but in your case, it's very close to another country. So can you tell us about what it's like to deal with Ciudad Juarez, the state of Chihuahua, and the government of Mexico? How does all that fit into your resiliency efforts, especially around the Rio Grande?
Sure. So that's a big question, but I will try to tackle it. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about I-10, and when I talk to folks about El Paso, and one of the reasons I wanted to show all the imagery so that you guys get an idea of what El Paso looks like, is when I say, have you ever been to El Paso? Folks say, well, I've driven down I-10. I've been through it. I think that's a lifeline of our entire community. There's a lot of commerce that comes back and forth, and that ties a lot back to the international border. So about $90 billion in economic impact every year come across the international border and hit I-10, and then go out to the rest of the country, right? And so it's extremely important for us to make sure that we are keeping that lifeline open, keeping it flowing, but at the same time, it presents a pretty significant challenge, and it's a divider, north and south El Paso, and that's where you're going to see the difference, the equity divide that I was being asked about a moment ago. And so as we start to learn how to leverage that and understand the importance of that corridor, how are we also developing in a way that doesn't separate or segregate our city? And so those are some of the challenges that we face. In terms of just dealing with Ciudad Juarez, and really trying to understand that it's shared air, it's shared water. This has to be a shared decision-making process. We've recently convened a binational task force. Excuse me, I'm gonna lose my voice a little bit. A binational task force that actually convenes the two cities' city councils quarterly. And so we sit down, and particularly my job as the resilience officer, I am to coordinate with their resilience officer and present potential policy that can be adopted binationally. Because we have to have that cooperation, because doing it on one side of a city does no good if you're not doing it on the other side. So imagine if half of Los Angeles adopted one policy and the other half adopted a different policy. Although I don't think that actually happens, but I mean that you can't function that way. And so it's similar, but it's just a lot more complicated because of the international border, and quite frankly, because of the perceptions of the border.
That actually is a good kind of, I'm getting the hook, we're over, but that's how Baton Rouge operates, by the way. Half operate by one set, and the other half uses a different set, I think. No, I'm kidding. That's my St. George jab. Okay, anyway, Bev,
Great.
we can get off the
join me in
stage
giving
now.
a round of applause for this phenomenal panel.